Good afternoon. It's rounding noon in about 60 seconds. My name is William Page. I am the current program manager at the UVA Center for Public Safety and Justice. Welcome to our panel series for 2025. The center, newly created in October of last year, focuses on networking, education, and research. To continue that motive, today we have a series of panelists who are well esteemed in their own regard, who you'll hear from today. But our topic today is community policing, building public trust, moderated by MJ Farr. Jay, it's over to you.
All right. I'll start off just very briefly, so you know who's here today. My name's Jay Farr, formerly Chief of Police in Arlington County, Virginia. I've been down here at the center for the last 4 years, so I'll be the moderator for today. So I'll start off with thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. I think it'll be an important and insightful conversation on our panel today. It's titled Building and Sustaining Community Relations Amidst Technological Challenges, and we know those exist. We'll explore evolving roles of community policing, public trust partnerships, and the impact of technology on law enforcement. I'm going to start off by just giving you a little background of who's here, but then I'm going to have them step in and give their own introduction. So first, we have Chief David Huchler. He's the Chief of Police for the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. Chief Huchler also was with the city of Alexandria prior to that and brings decades of experience in both municipal and federal law enforcement coordination. Then I have Ganesha Martin, the CEO of Let's Meet in the Middle, the former director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice in Baltimore, where she led efforts in violence reduction, reentry, and community trust building. And also joining us is Dr. Jennifer Griffin, Chief of Police at Temple University and Vice President for Public Safety at Temple, and a former Delaware State Police Captain. Dr. Griffin bridges the gap between field experience and higher education and has been a champion through her career of officer wellness and community engagement. So, quite a diverse group. Looking forward to everybody's input as we move through this today. But before I dive into any of the questions, I thought I'd just start off by opening up for comments from our panelists for opening or introduction. So I'll go first to Chief David Huchler.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Chief Farr, for inviting us to this forum for an important discussion. I'm excited to talk a little bit about my experience. Working in the city of Alexandria for 26 years, retired as a deputy chief, then came over to the Airports Authority. And I think this gives me a unique perspective, along with my colleagues, because the type of policing we do, while it's pretty much the same as any other police department, we also have a dual mission of policing and security. The other uniqueness about where I work now is it's a Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. It's an authority. It's governed by a board of directors of 17 members, 7 out of Virginia, 3 out of Maryland, 4 out of DC, and then there's also 3 presidential appointments. And as you can imagine, from a political standpoint, that creates a dynamic that I think is unique to the authority. We're also a revenue generator, even though we're not federal, we are an authority, so that creates its own uniqueness. We have our challenges like any other municipality, but it also creates opportunity. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get further into the discussion. So again, happy to be here to bring in this perspective from a policing and security mission and how that overlays with community policing technology. And I see we have Julie Parker that's with us today, and also branding. I know Julie Parker talks often about branding. When you're working with a revenue generating corporate body politic, it creates challenges in and of itself, and I'll touch on that as well. So thank you for having me today.
All right, Dave, great to have you with us. And let's go to Ms. Martin and get a little background.
Good, afternoon. It's so great to be here, and I love this panel. I love the diversity of our backgrounds. I will add that in addition to being at the mayor's office, I did spend almost a decade at the Baltimore Police Department in various roles. Came over after being assistant deputy mayor of public safety and emergency management to be the chief of staff to the police commissioner. who was brought in from California and focused on building community trust. After I think it was 1 in 6 or so citizens in Baltimore had been arrested, usually for low-level offenses. And I always make a joke, the chief is okay with it, that watching East Coast policing meet West Coast policing was like the worst Super Bowl ever you wanted to experience. But I learned quite a bit. So I was the chief of staff. And then this was, and I'll go just a little bit into this piece of the background because I think it's pertinent for the conversation today. But right after Ferguson, the police commissioner asked me to go up to our Maryland Legislative Assembly because they were going to fix policing, and he asked me to kind of be there and make sure anything that happened actually was helpful. But I got to interact with a lot of activists. And in doing so, I really saw the distrust, even some go as far as to say the hate from some activists in the police department. So I asked to create the Bureau of Community Engagement. When I came back, the commissioner said yes. And then the very next day, Freddie Gray died. And I think that's really pertinent, right? Because just 3 days ago was the 10-year anniversary of the riots and uprising in Baltimore. And really, that's where I really started to see the relationships with community, with police, and how important that was to try to build that back. And my last role at the police department was the chief of the Department of Justice, Compliance, Accountability, and External Affairs, which is a whole bunch of words to say that I helped negotiate the consent decree and create the infrastructure for reform while still fighting 300 plus murders. And so obviously that experience with Baltimore has carried me through to the work that I do as the CEO and founder of Let's Meet in the Middle, because that's what we had to try to figure out in Baltimore to move us forward. So thank you for creating the space for us to have this conversation today, and I'm glad to be with you all.
Well, thank you very much. And I think, well, there's a lot to unpack there, but the one continuing thing that I hear, and I think that we'll talk about as we move through this, and we're going to have some time later in the panel to talk about some of your unique experiences in Baltimore, is trust. And that, I think, is the underlying thing that as we go through this entire thing today is how do we build it? Yeah, I love your comment about how do you fix policing, which is an interesting thought about how to fix it.
I usually go like this when I say
Okay, all right, great. Thank you very much. Chief Griffin.
Sounds great. Well, good afternoon. First, thank you very much for having me with this group of panelists. Everybody's very unique in their background, but I think, again, we all have a love of policing, a love of community, and I think that that'll show through in the presentation today. So I have been at the Temple University for 2.5 years. My position was newly created. I was brought in to really look at how we were doing things and move us forward, look at best practices. And I'm very fortunate. I love our Temple community. We are in a major city. So, Philadelphia is one of the top 5 largest in the country. The Temple University has 30,000 students, 10,000 faculty. It's an R1. It also has a trauma hospital, 6 campuses within the university. And then, just the challenges, we're going to talk about technology and community policing. I'm fortunate, as many universities are dealing with budgetary constraints and things, that public safety has always been a priority. And so I have a $32 million budget to utilize, which we've been able to do a lot of enhancements in our community policing, different type of safety that we've incorporated to really serve the community, and not just our Temple community, but the neighboring community of North Philadelphia. And so we've been able to really leverage not just resources and state funding, but also relationships that we had going on with students and faculty and staff, and move that out into the community with our engagement unit. So I'm excited to talk today, and looking forward to questions at the end as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And yes, the relationship, because I think about this in my own environment at University of Virginia in Charlottesville, it'd be interesting to see how you balance that between the university and the surrounding community. Excellent. Well, I'll tell you what, let's get this started. And I'm going to start off with the first question, or the first sort of area of interest. How do you define community policing in the context of fostering public trust? And what are the core principles that make that work? I'll start with Chief Huchler.
Thanks, Jay. So, with my experience in a municipality and then coming to the airports, I was a little skeptical when I first got here because we don't have the same community as a municipality. And so I thought defining community policing or community would be quite different. And what I found is it really isn't. I think community policing, community itself transcends any geographically defined area, municipality. And when I first got here, we would host a community police academy. And my first thought was, why would an airport police department do that? And as I started to learn about the department and I learned about the airport community, we are no different than any municipality. It's just our uniqueness is we do not have any residences. And so when we talk about community, you may think, well, if people don't live there, you don't have a community. But just like a municipality, we have a business community. And, our community is very dynamic, from airlines to concessions to businesses to our traveling public. And for our traveling public, we have more than 48 million people that pass through both our airports. And I don't know if we said on the Upstart, but I oversee the police department for Reagan National and Dulles International Airport, along with the toll road. And so I had to learn quite quickly that we just had to adjust a little bit of how we engaged with our community. And oftentimes, when you look at community policing, again, the definition doesn't change. You want to be proactive, you want to build relationships, you want to identify issues, and all that's present within that. We do it in municipalities, in the business community. And so it's really, my community is like a business community on steroids, just because we have the dynamics of, you name the law enforcement agency, they are at the airport. So that's part of my community. The concessions, the workers that work for the contractors at airports. And so there's a lot of uniqueness to the different types of communities. And what I had to learn, it goes beyond just the geographic area. It really is dealing with individual groups. And I will say for the individual groups, they all have the same needs, the wants, desires, the common goals, the common interests. But the difference is their advocacy or their activism is much more limited, because at the airports, we literally control just about everything that occurs within the airport community. And so we have this dual role of supporting the community and working with them. And then because of the airport's authority, the nature of what we do, they're the overlaying, dare I say, a governmental entity that's overseeing and directing a lot. We have a lot of influence over how the community is policed. But I try not to let that run roughshod over the community. We want to ensure that we continue to collaborate with them, see what their needs are, see how they want to be policed, and just really implement the same tenets of community policing that most of us have done over our decades of experience. And I think that, with whether it's procedural justice or problem-oriented policing or engagement, we continue to enact or engage our community in the same manner that many other departments do with their own communities.
So you did you gave a really good overview of where you see similarities and some differences in the environment you're operating in. I did have just one quick follow-up before I move on. And that really comes down to, because I know you came out of Alexandria, and so when you're working in this environment, how do you really find a measure? So a measure of success for community policing in a very transient environment.
Yeah, it's a good question, because, as I said, we have a big population that is transient. But interestingly enough, a lot of that community visits the airports regularly and communicates through our corporate office regularly. So one of the ways we measure is through the feedback to our corporate offices. There's a lot of mechanisms that they receive information from our traveling community. We also do surveys. So we provide police service, again, to the traveling community, to the business community. And I have my staff do outreach on our police services to get a gauge on how we're doing. And that's a formalized process. We do a semi-annual report on what the community feels on how we're doing that policing, or how we're providing police service. And then we have a lot of meetings at the airport where we are present as part of a larger meeting. And we get a lot of feedback direct from the airlines or other business members on how my staff is engaging them, whether it's through enforcement activities, problems they're having. You know, one of the issues we do have is with some homelessness, and sometimes that causes problems for the business community, just like in a municipality. So through corporate surveys, through our own police department surveys, and through meetings and engagement with the community, we do receive a significant amount of feedback that allows me to gauge on how we're providing service to the community.
Great, thanks, Dave. I'm going to go next to Ganesha. I can either with the same question, or I can give you something a little bit different. If you remember, the original question was around the context of fostering public trust. So I'll put it to you, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'll answer the same question, Jay, because we were just getting to know each other, but I think I can tell you have a flair for drama. So I'm gonna shake it up for you a little bit. Look at his face. He's like, no, that's not true. um, so, I've really been contemplating this for the past couple of years, community policing, and it really actually led me to meet me in the middle and start working on it. I actually don't like saying the word anymore. It means so many different things to so many people. And what I've seen across the country is that it really, unless there's some outliers, focuses on events, right? How many backpacks did we give out? How many people came to Coffee with a Cop? And I don't take anything away from those events, because as I kind of started thinking about this a couple of years ago, if you take those events away, there are going to be people that are very upset and feel very, like they're not engaged and feel abandoned. But having worked in Baltimore and again around the country, the people that come to those events are generally the people that like the police or hate them, right? Are going to protest. And so I've been toying with some other, words, human-centered policing, engagement, different things like that. And the other thing I'm working on with a police department right now on a strategic plan for their community policing. And, they really defined it as just the partnerships, right, that you have with community groups. And then I'm working with some other folks who really just define that. They use POP and they use Sarah a little bit. But the other thing I've seen for usually when people say POP and Sarah, if you take it like one step down or two steps down, it's not operationalized. It's not something that is done on a regular, consistent basis, that has data that you can track, that lets you know if you're making an impact. And so, I'm really kind of on a soapbox saying that we need to come up with some metrics that matter the same way that we have metrics that align with our crime strategies. And we know if crime is going up or down. We don't always know exactly why, right? But we can measure and see that something's happening in a specific area because we've implemented a program, or some sort of plan. I'd like for us to be able to do the same with community policing, whether that's the community and the police, define that as trust, increasing trust. If that is, increasing the feeling of safety, whatever the police, and when I say police, I mean line level officers and supervisors and the communities that they interact with the most, whatever they define those metrics to be, what can we do? And we'll get to the technology because I think we need that as a force multiplier. But how do we utilize that to help us measure impact? Now I'll step off my soapbox. I hope I answered your question to a certain degree. I think we need to redefine how we define community policing.
Okay, so I fully appreciate where you're coming from in that. But if you remember, so I want to go back to what you talked about in the opening a little bit, and you talked about with the issue with Mr. Gray coming up and what happened when you're talking about Baltimore. And so you may develop a long-term plan, and you may think about how you're going to address this.
Mm-hmm.
But I did want to ask you though, when you're on the short end of this, what strategies do you find most effective in building trust quickly in communities where prior efforts have failed? How do you build that when you're coming in and other efforts like you've outlined are failing?
Yeah. So I have two examples in my head. One was obviously right after the uprising and the riots. A lot of distrust obviously bubbled up. This was decades in the making. And so what I saw to be the most effective is when we showed up in the community, asking questions, and where appropriate, owning up to our failures beforehand. Um, Obviously that gets sticky, and you can't, police chiefs that stand up, as the ones on the call know, they can't stand up in front of the press conference and say, well, my lawyer said I can't say this, right? Or, X, Y, and Z. But it becomes very sticky when you want to maybe own up and say, yeah, we misstepped right here. Maybe it even wasn't me. It was on, somebody else's watch, but we misstepped, and your lawyers are saying, yeah, no, because these lawsuits are about to come in, and you can't say that. And then, it's the chief standing there holding the bag. But to the extent that you can, to come in and say, hey, this is what that we did, and we want to sit down with you and figure out how to move forward, I think is important. The other thing where this comes to my mind is, and we may talk about this a little bit later, but what's been come to known in recent times is CVI, so community violence intervention, sometimes called focused deterrence, GVRS, those sorts of things, but essentially using people who have prior criminal history to reduce violence in communities where they have trust already. Baltimore did not do well at that in 2 prior iterations. And so when I conceived this work as the way to move forward in Baltimore, when I was in the mayor's office, I got a community group that had that integrity, who had that that trust. And I said, I need you to help us go into the community and say, hey, this didn't work the first 2 times. As a matter of fact, I think we really pissed y'all off, but we're here now to do it differently. And so even the community member who we've become very close, I talked to her 2 or 3 times about it. She said, yeah, Ganesha, I'll help you. And then finally I said, well, it was called this. Oh, that program, that bleepity bleep. I mean, she went off about it. And then she said, yeah, I'll help you. So again, going to the community, knowing when you can step in there and do the work, but then also knowing when you need an intermediary to come in and help you kind of do that olive branch. But at the end of the day, you gotta go and be amongst the community, I think, to start building that trust immediately.
Great. And you made me think of something. And Chief Griffin, when I asked you this question, I phrased the question. It says, how do you adopt, for the university, your question would be this: how do you adopt community policing to a university environment? But what I started to think about is, one of the courses we teach is really how to create and sustain community dialogue. And I think that's probably I should have rephrased it. How do you create and sustain that kind of community dialogue within the university environment?
So I think one of the things I love about the university, coming from, working in the state police, is, you have so many different communities that you have to attend to, right? And it's really meeting people where they are and figuring out their needs. So I think, Ganesha said something that's critically important in any relationship, but that's developing and building trust. And that means you have to show up every day in the good times and the bad and be honest and genuine. And I think community members very much value that. I think they can also see that in law enforcement leadership when somebody shows up, and nobody is perfect. Our agencies, our departments, the city, things don't always go as we would like, and we've got to show up. We've got to own it. I think for a university environment, it's, catering to those needs of the unique groups, right? So I have students' parents that are another population you have to attend to and serve. I have faculty and staff. And then you have people who work, visit, and live in the area. We have North Philadelphia community. And, our student population, I jokingly say, like, every year they get a year younger, and every year as police, we get a year older. So the student population continues to turn over. So even when you develop relationships, and this is a little bit different than, my state police experience, you developed relationships and people, they might be there 20, 30 years, right? Community leaders. In a university environment, the university student government changes every year. The leadership changes, especially in higher ed right now. Your presidents, your chancellors are turning over quite frequently. So there's a lot of different communities that you have to manage and try to work with. But for our students, our faculty, our community, that lives and works around the area, it's really developing relationships, being honest with them, like, what do you need from us? And honestly saying what we're able to provide, and then also engaging consistently. You can't come in, and Ganesha talked about this, you can't come in and run a great program and then disappear for the next 6 months. You've got to have active engagement. We've reorganized the entire department since I've joined here. We added a captain of engagement unit and also security operations. And his job, along with the officers that work in the unit, it is just consistently, we need to be in the schools, running programs, being present, reading clubs, book donations, summer programs, like just nonstop, because those communities, like our college community, they turn over. And so we've got to be the consistent presence in those relationships. And then just, having structured forums as well. And I'll talk a little bit later about a student safety advisory group that I formed. We have multiple community groups that we get information from, but it's really about being consistent, being genuine, and fostering relationships even during the challenging times.
So so I think about this, and I gave a lot of thought to what's been going on in the last year and a half with the universities and the tensions that have come on universities for a variety of different reasons. And so in your role as a university police chief, I am curious though as to, and you talked about this a little bit, how you manage the tension between safety and enforcement, which is, it has to be done, but at the same time, how do you create a welcoming academic space or a place where people feel safe to pursue their academic career? So just how do you get to that balance?
So it is a balance, and we recognize public safety isn't all about enforcement, but that is a piece, that is one of the tools that we have in our toolbox. I would say, for how do you manage the tension, especially if you look at what is happening across the country with some of the geopolitical issues and some of the internal, issues that we see, is law enforcement should always be impartial. Like, we don't take a side, we are enforcing laws. The university partners enforce policies and rules, but it's really our job to try to communicate to different groups, behind the scenes. And, my job is to really create a safe space for groups to protest. I'm not here to crush their protests. I'm not here to dissuade them, but I'm here to create a safe environment for them, for counter protesters, for students who are just trying to get to class. And so you really do have to have a lot of communication. You've got to develop relationships. And some of these groups that we deal with, they don't want to have a relationship with law enforcement. So that makes it even more challenging because they don't want to come to the table. But I always try to remind myself, like, it's my job as the professional, it's my job as the leader of, of public safety, is to continue to work at that. And that nobody can come back later and say, Chief Griffin never tried to establish a relationship. And so, you have to let them know where the guidelines are too. Like, you have to establish boundaries. Like, the university has rules and policies. We're going to enforce those. We would love to participate in this process with you. And so I think it's, and I'll speak to you, we've had numerous protests. We've had very few issues though, where we've had disruptions. And I think part of that is the work that goes in, not just from public safety, but by student affairs, by our ideal office, by different groups within the university, to try to come together. And so for us, from the beginning of when we started having protests and demonstrations, I went to university leadership and I said, this isn't just a public safety issue. This is a university concern. And so we're not just going to have police out on the line. We're going to have administrators. We're going to have people from the religious, our faith-based community out there. We're going to have advisors, student affairs. And when you have a community from, the university standing out there with the students and connecting with them, I think it really changes the temperature and it changes the dynamic, that it wasn't just an overwhelming public safety presence, right? So I think that really does help campuses when you have the ability to do that, when you have a lot more partners than just using police all the time. Because we want to have good relationships. And if the only thing we're doing is going in and arresting, and that's our only contact with people, that's going to be how we're perceived. So I think there's a statistic, you have to have 3 positives for every 1 negative. It might even be higher than that. But, continuing to have those dialogues that are sometimes challenging, making sure that our officers are trained. We spend a lot of time and resources on having solid policies, making sure everybody's aware of those. We train to those. We do joint training with Philadelphia Police Department, and just making sure that we're all on the same page to serve the community that's really struggling with some of the issues that are going on right now. While being mindful, Jay, that there's also a high portion of our students that have no interest in the issue that is at hand. And we still have a responsibility to make sure they can get to class or work or continue to have, work in this space.
Well, one of the things as I listened, as you went through that, one of the things that it reminds me of is, how critically important it is that you truly understand who your stakeholders are, where they are in relationship to what you're trying to achieve, and more importantly, and going back to that, creating dialogue, that they're engaged in that process. So great answer. Appreciate the feedback there. So with that said, I want to move on to, talking about strategies that actually work. And I'm going to start with Miss Martin, because I know she has some background in this, and it comes down to this. How do you have public-private partnerships enhance transparency? And I think my first sort of directed question to you would be, how can these partnerships be structured to ensure long-term sustainability and community accountability?
Yeah, that's hard, right? And it's hard because while we do have communities that, kind of turn over and leadership changes, community does not change as fast as police leadership and politicians. And having worked for a couple of mayors and a couple of police commissioners, and during one of the most, I'll call it tumultuous times in our history. I was just actually talking to my brother the other day, and I said, just casually talking, I said, policing is the most hyperbolic and overused political football there is. And he's not in policing or anything, but he goes, what do you mean by that? And I said, let me say a couple of words to you. Defund. Did you just automatically feel something one way or the other, right? And then I said, back the blue. Did you just automatically feel? I said, you say any of those words and people scatter to their corners. And you don't even really have to do very much else, right? And if you're a politician trying to win an election, or you're trying to distance yourself from a very bad news story as a public safety leader, you can do those sorts of things. And so building sustainability is very difficult. When I try to do it, and I'm working in a city right now that's doing their I don't think it's public, so I'm not going to mention them, but I think it'll become public pretty soon. But they're doing the same thing. I think it's going to work. You've got to look at the landscape, right? And look at the stakeholders and who influences who. And so I usually always bring in some money people, right? Because the money people fund the political elections. And I don't care what side you're on or whatever, but if you're funding folks, or if you're the business community, you generally have the leverage. Those are fortunately and unfortunately the calls that have to be picked up at some point by police chiefs and mayors, generally, not all the time, but generally. And so I always bring those folks in some sort of strategic way. And then you want to bring in the the city agencies, not only the agency heads, but down into the ranks of those folks who've been there 20, 30 years sometimes. And then you want, then I go to the community, obviously. And I try to not only talk to the people in the community who remember back when, I always talk about officer friendly and, you know, all those sorts of things, all the way to the young people who don't remember that, don't care about that. They just want to be left alone. And so bringing all those folks in at the beginning so that, and I often think about the example in Oakland. So almost 15, 20 years ago, Oakland wanted to venture into the CBI, or focused deterrence space. And the community got together and rallied, and then put, you know, and made it a political issue that every mayoral candidate had to speak to. And then when they got in, they then further pushed for it to become a bond issue so that it's a line item. So that for taxpayers to pay, so that money was always there. And you know, still to this day, those efforts continue. So I think you've got to always make sure you got the stakeholders engaged in multiple levels, but the best way you can try to create sustainability is to try to inculcate a funding mechanism, so that funding mechanism is there into the future, no matter who that those changes are. And you have those people at those different pressure levels, that if the mayor wants to change their mind, or the community wants to change their mind, the police want to change their mind, somebody, you know, is there and created a system where you can talk about what's the best way to keep the work going, even if it needs to shift a little bit. So that's kind of how I've worked it, and with varying levels of success, I have to say.
Well, you got to get up and swing, don't you? So look at it's an interesting thought, though, that you have that independent way of funding to keep a project or a program independent moving forward. I'm not sure. I'd like to, if we had more time, I'd be curious how you actually sometimes can make that happen in some of these more politically charged environments. But great feedback on how that might work. Thank you. So keeping the same idea in mind, Chief Huchler, when we talk about strategies that worked, I did have a question for you, and it really comes down to, you know, from your perspective in the transportation industry, you know, what lessons have you learned from adapting best practices to a very high security multi-agency environment like the Washington metropolitan airports?
Jay, I hate to say you broke up a little bit. I didn't hear the last part of that question.
My question really was, what lessons have you learned from adapting best practices to a high security multi-agency environment like yours, which is unique for the airports?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, as I listen to my colleagues on the panel, being in this security environment comes with challenges, but also opportunities. And so when you look at protests, we do want overwhelming police presence. We do work with those protest leaders, but we're very strict on what we allow them to do. It is permitted, and if they start to go beyond what is permitted, we don't allow for much more to happen, and we'll go ahead and intervene because of the security posture. The airports are highly regulated. From the time you step off the curb into the terminal out to your aircraft, you are pretty much being told what to do. The airports authority is set up where we can, just like a municipality, we can create our own rules and regulations. So we have enforcement tools that may not be in a municipality, but that are specific to the airport industry. We're guided by the FAA Part 139 in our security measures. So as I said, that gives us great opportunity because we can control a lot of activity that may go wayward or not be conducive to the business aspects. And along those lines, the difference is, you know, when we have an incident, critical incident, a protest, or something at the airport, there is a domino effect that goes across the country. So example, we've had recent protests where they've wanted to shut down our curbs. If that occurs, you think about the flight crews that can't get to the aircraft. Those aircraft can't take off. Now you start creating delays system-wide across our airport. So with that being said, I think your question is how do we blend some of this together? I think the same principles pertain at the airports as elsewhere. We use I don't want to say best practices. That's probably not always the best way to describe something, but we look at our partners in other police departments and what they're doing and see how we can adapt it to what is occurring at the airports. One of the things that I'm very proud of that we've done, not only in Alexandria when I was there, but what we're currently doing with George Mason University. And what we're trying to do is implement best practices or policy practices. And as you may know, and Jay, I hate to say this, I know this is a UVA sponsored event. I'm talking about George Mason, but they're in our backyard. So my apologies right there. But what we have done is we look at crime policy and see how we can translate that into best police services overlaid with our security mission. And what we have found is that it works quite well in terms of taking our analytics with data, our engagement with our officers to the community, our enforcement activity, and evaluating those, and then translating that into our deployment. And so one of the things we're currently working on is we use concentric circles really for security at the airports. It goes, out to the traffic on the toll road, to the metro entryways into the airport, to the curb, out to our airside, which is a secure area. When I talk about the metros, we just entered into an agreement with Metro Transit in which they're paying us, reimbursing overtime for us to do security at those entry points. What we've had is the university come in and evaluate that interaction between fare evasion and our officers, and to see what impact that's going to have across our airports in terms of crime. We're then also using those interactions to work with our airport community, whether it's the concessions, because those that are violating usually work at the airports. The next step in all of this is taking all that information, all that data, all those interactions, and training our department on what's going to be the best deployment strategy or engagement, whether it's through hotspot recognition and policing. One of the things we've done in the last 7 years I've been here is really make procedural justice the foundational element in everything we do, but how that also engages our community in trying to thwart crime and terrorism. So I think there is a huge blend in providing police service, but also with the underpinning, we have a security mission that at times, as it should be, is inflexible to what may be a typical police response or police service. And we're guided through law and policy. So we're in good standing with law, policy, and certainly the Constitution. But once you cross some thresholds within the airport community, the security mission takes priority, and we're inflexible in what we're able to do or achieve. And as I said, sometimes that creates opportunity and sometimes it creates challenges. But by having a well-trained police force, we can blend those two and come on the better side of good outcomes.
Well, yeah, hopefully when we get a little bit further into this, we start talking a little more about the technology. You talked a lot about data and data collection and how that comes into play, and how critical it is about how you use it and analyze it effectively. So I'm hoping we can get back and revisit that. And the good news, Dave, remember, Mason was an extension of UVA first, and then it became George Mason, so you're safe.
Sorry, I should have kept that to myself.
There you
Sorry.
go. That's fine. So for Chief Griffin, keeping in the sort of the same role, I had a couple questions for you, but I'm going to sort of condense it down to one. So in your time as a chief, what do you think has been the most impactful campus-wide initiative you've implemented or your agency's implemented to promote safety and trust on the campus?
Jay, that's hard. Just picking one. So I'm gonna divert and I'm gonna give you two. But I think there's two things. One, as we've all talked about, it's about building trust, and that means being transparent, and that means engaging on multiple different levels through different means, right? Because you can't just, you're not going to be able to meet every individual in every group doing, one thing. And so I think one of the things to connect with our larger community, which is our students, our 30,000 plus students, is, when I got here, we created a student safety advisory committee. And so they're a group of individuals throughout the university. They have Temple student government, we have over 300 student organizations. There's faith-based leaders, there's undergrad, graduate, athletes, every different group within the university. We try to get representation on that, and we meet with them monthly. So they get to meet with myself, the chief, our deputy chiefs, our Office of Emergency Management, our director of messaging and communication, and then other university leaders. And we have these very candid, open conversations. And I think the number one thing as law enforcement is we need to listen. So much of the time we're, especially as chiefs, like it's our job to make decisions and move forward and implement things, but we really have to take a moment to listen. And, Dave said this when he talks about like, he has a lot of different populations and locations he's managing as well. But you don't know what their needs are unless you really hear them. And so sitting down on a monthly basis with our students and really listening to what their needs and concerns are, because as a parent of somebody who's college age, like, I think I know what the issues are. And then they come to the table and they bring things and they're not even worried about this issue that we're maybe concerned about. They have these other needs. So I think that student advisory committee was really important for me. It was important because it also shows no matter what's going on, we could have protests, we could have, if you look at what's going on with visas right now, you can look at, technology, and I know we're going to talk about that. And, just giving them the ability to sit down and ask whatever question they want to and tell us what they need has been probably one of the most important things I've done for our student population. For the wider group, like for the community at large, I'll say that 2 years ago, we had an extensive safety assessment from throughout campus by a organization, 21CP Solutions, that did a full range assessment. We also had a violence reduction task force and a mental health task force here at the university who did an assessment. And when we had all of these different things, and I was looking at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, we had 68 recommendations over here with sub recommendations, and mental health has this and violence reduction. And I was able to work with some amazing people here at the university. And I said, I need a visual display that a community member or anybody can go to 24 hours a day and say, okay, how is public safety doing with this recommendation? Or how are they doing with mental health? And so amazing programmers here created a beautiful dashboard that we share. It's updated daily, so everything is, fresh. And it shows people like where we are with certain policies, with First Amendment assemblies, where we are with training with our officers, how we're moving through our accreditation, like all of these things, I think really took the temperature and it really changed the temperature, because we got these recommendations and everybody's like, what are you going to do with them? How are you going to report on it? And we just put it all out there, good or bad, and said, this is what we're doing. So I think those are two things. One, having that group that we work with our student population, because at a university, that's your major population, in addition to doing different webinars or having open sessions for parents, doing orientation, meeting faculty and staff, doing the dean's meetings, doing leadership meetings, any opportunity we can get in front of people to share, these are the resources we have, what are your needs, as well as the dashboard, being completely transparent with where we are on that, I think really has created a really open and trusting environment where people are, there's nothing being hidden. We're being really transparent about it. And I think that's really changed the dynamic and the relationship between our different populations.
So, because I had a follow up on this, but I think you may have answered it. But because my next topical area is really around that, forming those partnerships with your communities. But my question would have been, and maybe it's slightly different. How have you navigated the dual accountability to both the university administration and the surrounding Philadelphia community? And like I said, I asked you this because I see what the chief of police in Charlottesville is finding that balance with Charlottesville and UVA.
Yeah, it's a balancing act. Like, the one thing I love about policing is it's dynamic, it's ever changing, but the thing that should always stay the same is our shared purpose. So whether it's, Temple University police officers or it's the Philadelphia Police Department, we have a shared purpose to keep our community safe. And we have a joined community. We have an MOU existing with them. We respond way beyond our campus. And then they're also on campus with different types of events and things like that. So I think the balance is really just having clear guidelines and, that we support each other. We have a shared purpose. For Temple University, 40% of our calls have nothing to do with Temple. They have nothing to do with a student, with the faculty, with the staff, or one of our properties. They're incidents or issues that happen within the community that are primary jurisdiction of Philadelphia Police Department. And so that just goes to show the shared teamwork and collaboration and support that the university provides, not just for our campus, but for the area around us. And so I think that dual accountability is really understanding the needs of those different communities, meeting them where they are, making sure that we have shared purpose in this environment where law enforcement, 25 years ago when I came into law enforcement, it was so challenging and competitive. There were so many applicants. I went to the state police, there were 1,500 applications for 25 spots. It was really very competitive. And right now in law enforcement, we struggle with recruitment and retention. And so we're all trying to use our resources with strategy and intentionality. And that also means, how do we use the resources of the neighboring police communities? Like, how do we share technology? Like, we have 1,500 cameras here on campus, and we have access to Philly's cameras. We give them access to our camera data and footage. So, we have license plate readers, we have gun detection devices. Like, how do we share not just that dual mission and kind of what you said, that accountability piece, but how do we share every resource we both have to make the community as safe as we can?
Great. I think about what you're saying and all the different parties that you are engaging and how you create that sort of matrix of response. And so I'm going to keep along that same line a little bit, and I'm going to talk to Ganesha, and I want to talk to you just a little bit about Baltimore, because we talked about a little bit earlier. And I know you were involved in place-based engagement to uplift marginalized voices. And specifically, what methods helped you identify authentic community leadership and ensure those voices were prioritized? And as I listen to Chief Griffin, I'm also thinking that you've got all these different parties involved. How do you make sure who needs to get heard gets heard? And so I'd be sort of curious from that perspective.
Yeah, very early on in my tenure in public safety and in Baltimore, in particular, I was running pillar to post. Everybody who was yelling at us, I was trying to have a conversation with. I was trying to figure out how can we work it out, so that it just wasn't us getting shouted down at council hearings and things of that nature. And probably after about 2 years or so, I started realizing that there were folks who wanted to come to the table and really just had not been given the opportunity to do so. And once they came to the table, one of my favorite examples is bringing some folks in over the weekend to look at our use of force policy, and they came in pissed, particularly. And one of the things that they really picked up on and talked about was how the Baltimore Police Department curbed young people in particular, but making folks sit on the curb, whether it was cold, hot, raining, whatever it was, and have their legs crossed. And so I asked, why does that happen? And some of the officers responded, well, we don't have cages in our cars. So if we put them in our car, that's an officer safety issue. All sorts of issues are happening. So when I reported that back to the group, they wrote a letter to the commissioner and said, buy cages. And then there was cages that were bought. That's a horrible word. We need a better word than that. But the divider, right, that goes there. But I'm forgetting your question because I went all the way down memory lane. But I think it was, authentic voices, right? And so I started realizing that even there were ones that would shout us down, say all type of stuff. And then when the cameras were gone, they come up and hug me. Hey, Ganesha, how's it going? And so I just started interacting with those groups in very different ways. And then I also just started realizing that there was a lot of folks who would want to be engaged, but could not because they had 2 or 3 jobs, because the bus routes did not get them where they needed to go in enough time. They had families to get home to cook for, and all sorts of things. And so creating opportunities where you are in the community, maybe where people are already going to be. The other thing I started really realizing is don't show up empty-handed. A lot of these communities, particularly marginalized communities, I just heard a police commander the other day call it compromised communities, have been historically disinvested. And so police happen to be the 24/7 face of government. But there's a lot of other people in that ecosystem that have let those folks down, or even outright promised something that they didn't do. And so getting them to come to a meeting, getting them to come to an event is going to be difficult. So you might have to get out and door knock. Again, you might have to go to a place where they feel safe. I had an experience. Again, I'm not from Baltimore. I do say I'm not from Baltimore, but you can make me act like I am if you if you push me. But I had an experience. So I grew up in Texas. So this was a different experience for me, but so I didn't have the long history, which I think played well to a certain degree with the distrust with the police department. And so I was at an event. It was a young man. He just got out of a halfway house, and he was at this event. He was excited about his future, and we just kind of started talking. And I said, whatever you need, call me. Here's my card. And when he saw that the gold badge on my card, he gave it back and literally ran away from me. I mean, and I'm like, what? And later on, he circled back around. He says, ma'am, I'm sorry, you're really nice, but if I get caught in my neighborhood with that card, it's not going to be good for me. And that set heavy in me, right? Because I'm a person who he knew who could give him some help, some sort of resources. But because of that distrust, because of those issues, he literally wouldn't even keep my card. Those are the types of things that I carry with me, so that I know I've got to go to the community. I've got to carry folks with me to the community to make sure that we're hearing those authentic voices. Because we often know the people that are loudest with the bullhorn are not always representing. I'll give one last example. I was doing some listening sessions in Minneapolis right after the defund, kind of thing was going on in their council. And you go into some of these communities and they're saying, no, we want more cops. We need more cops. We want them to act right when they come here. We want them to treat us, respectfully. But we want more cops. And so you would never know that if all you were doing was paying attention to the news. So it's really important. You got to go to where they are, though.
So I'm going to keep you on the hot seat for a minute. I'm going to move down the technology because I'm being mindful of time. But specifically after I just listened to your conversation around, especially how hard it is for some people, one, it's a trust issue or it's just a perception issue. So my question for you, the first one on the technology piece, we all know that technology brings promise and it also brings ethical risk. It just does.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you initiate tech transparency conversations in a low trust community?
Yeah, well, one of the things that just first came to me, and I'll go to the low trust, is like I said, this is an amazing panel. I didn't know these 2 chiefs prior to now, and they're not going to get rid of me. I'm already writing them emails in my head to talk about all the great stuff that they're doing, and just the way you can tell how somebody thinks about public safety when they speak about it. And so one of the easiest ways is to be consistent, right? Like the chiefs have said, show up and have that relationship before you start bringing the technology. That's actually the ideal way that you want to do that. But let's say you're in a situation like we happen to be actually in Baltimore, where you had low trust, but we had violence off the charts. You had community members calling every day, wanting to know who killed their son or their daughter or whatever. You had both of those. Again, those are not the stories that are in the newspaper. And so I can talk about this now because I've had therapy, but there was something called the spy plane in Baltimore that was funded by Arnold Foundation, and it had a good premise, but it was rolled out very poorly. So the way that the community thought that the technology was working is that from this plane, you could actually see in backyards, you could see into houses, but people were just specks on the ground. And if a 911 call came in and a speck was moving faster than another speck, you say that might be the suspect. And then you look at the CCTV to kind of then identify where that person went. But none of that was talked about beforehand. And so as we try to kind of pick up that fumble, we did demos during a press conference. We went to communities and did demonstrations. And so I'll be mindful of time and just say one of the things that I've learned from that is to go to them first. Tell them the public safety issue that you're trying to, first of all, address. It's usually something that's on their mind. Demonstrate it, let them see it, let them touch it to the extent that they want to, and gain that understanding. And then one of the things I've started to do, like even around like license plate readers with Flock that are now all, across the country, is if we're trying to go for carjackings, right? And we might have some young people that are doing, committing these carjackings. There may be some in there that have guns. They may even be shooters, right? But then there's some young ones in there that just are around for a joyride, and we want to keep them from being shooters. Why don't we have a program that surrounds that technology that handles the young person who's a shooter? There's a prosecutorial way to do that. But then there may be a programmatic way to keep that other young person from going down the pathway. Have those conversations with your community. What are the other things you can wrap around the technology to help them? So those are just a few things that come to mind.
All right, quite a few things come to mind. So I want to keep in that same vein. I'm going to go to Chief Griffin, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about, so thinking about what we were just talking about, what steps have you or the agency taken to ensure student and faculty voices shape campus surveillance and data policies?
Yes, I think the one thing that's really important is and I keep saying this, but it's so critically important. You just have to understand your specific community. One community you might come from, or, if you have multiple different diverse communities, might be very positive towards it. And I think Ganesha said in hers, like, in some of the communities, they're like, we don't want less police. We want more police. We just want them to engage in these, positive ways. So I think technology is one of those things that, one, you just have to educate people. This is what we're doing. This is why we're thinking of doing it. What are your thoughts? I'll say here at Temple, overwhelmingly positive response. And we've been very transparent. Again, there's no hidden cameras. We have 1,500 cameras. We advertise this. We want people to know there's a lot of cameras. We also share how they're used whenever we're, we actually have cameras that are in research rooms on filing cabinets. Like, that's some of the cameras, but we have them in open spaces. We have them in, shared spaces in our student center, in the library and stuff. So I think it's really just about being transparent. We also have a gun detection device on campus that looks for the shapes of guns in public spaces, and we use that because we know that FBI data says that the faster you can, people display a gun in active shooting situations minutes before they actually pull the trigger. Police are typically not called until somebody pulls the trigger. So if we can get police notified that somebody has a gun displayed sooner, and we can get a police officer there, we can decrease the number of shootings that we have. We can also engage people before that point. So that's, explaining the reasoning for why we have the technology, I think has been helpful. And then also sharing the successes. We had license plate readers. You're in public space, you're on public roadways, you're on camera all the time, everywhere you go now. So I think the dynamics too in our environment, our society is very different than it was 25 years ago, where it was like such a big thing to go into a shopping store or mall and be on camera. Now, everybody's on camera all the time. Our students are videotaping each other 24 hours a day and posting all kinds of things. So there's a lot less maybe hesitancy or, kind of angst about that. But when we started using the license plate readers, we thought maybe people would be a little apprehensive about this. We recovered a stolen vehicle within 2 weeks. We shared it with our community. We said, this is how the information is being used. We were able to get an individual who was in the stolen vehicle. We returned that vehicle to a community member whose vehicle was stolen that also was his work vehicle. So, we continue to use that and we show how the technology is being used for public safety. And we've seen overwhelming support of that. Now, frequently, we might be doing a presentation, we'll be talking about the technology. In fact, earlier today, we had 3 media stations and a student news group here at one of our buildings, because we just did a brand new communications center. And we brought them in and we showed them the space and we talked about how having an upgraded center and the new software and the hardware and ergonomically correct desks with temperature control, light control, tilting screens, more screens, like how this really integrates into our strategy of keeping our community safe, and how it also gives us the ability to use technology as a force multiplier, and that we don't need to have this overwhelming, policing presence when you use technology to help support police. And so I think it's really in how you craft the message and how you present it, but also in how your community feels about it. We've had overwhelming support. In fact, a lot of times here at the campus, they're like, we want more of this. We want more, public safety, presence. And we have a different, like kind of a stratified model with that. We just don't use police. We have detectives. We have our own security officers who are unarmed. We also have contracted security officers. So I try to tell people, like, we use a layered approach and we're very thoughtful and intentional about when we use police and when we use another partner within, the public safety family to, support them. And I think that's been very helpful when you're incorporating technology into your campus or into your environment, that they understand the reasoning why, the benefits, and that we're transparent about it. We're not putting things up and then surprising people later. We really try to celebrate it and show that it's part of our strategy.
So it looks like we might have lost Jay, and I'm gonna switch hats and become the moderator for a second. Chief Huchler, we have either we have a question for you in the chat, or I can go and ask you about interagency. Well, I can't do that. That's a setup. If you now choose my question and not the one for the chat. So when we're talking about community trust, so let me go read that one. I appreciate Chief Huchler's commitment to collaborating with academia to integrate data-driven decision-making. Given the opportunities of partnerships with local colleges and universities, what strategies would you recommend to other police leaders to foster these relationships and leverage academic expertise for research that leads to reliable data outcomes that will better serve their communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe one of the first things I would refer you to is there's an article that was published by the National Police Institute, written by Professor James Willis. And the article, I think it's the Ideas in American Policing through MPI, but he called it Improving Police, What's Craft Got to Do with It? And what Professor Willis was trying to articulate in this article is this blend of craft and science. And when we look at police officers, our experience lends itself to decision-making, right or wrong, on how we conduct ourselves or how we problem solve. And I think academia for years has been studying what police do, They come up with some really good strategies on how we can do it better. Yet with the experience of police, they've been reluctant to embrace what science or research has proven true. So the best advice I can give to anybody that's interested is you have to create a partnership with academia. So you look at what UVA is doing today. This is a great start. They got some great people that will help police departments, I think, gauge their strategies to see if they're going to be successful. And you only do that through partnerships. So my own example is with the local university here. When I was with the city of Alexandria, we did a study on procedural justice, and the university came in with students, and they gauged how successful we were with our engagement between suspects, witnesses, victims, and provided a report to us as to what was working and what wasn't working. What we're currently doing today, I think we're taking it to the next step. We're actually doing enforcement activity that's being reviewed by the university. And then they're going to provide strategies, not only a report, but then strategies on how we can better police our community effectively. But it all begins with the partnership. When they, and they had students doing an observational study, which if you know anything about research, observational studies are very expensive. But the university has used students to conduct surveillance. And what we did was we essentially downloaded, and to my colleagues, Chief Griffin in particular, you have 1,500 cameras. We probably have closer to 6,000. We've downloaded a number of our interactions through the camera system, which allowed students to observe police activity without actually having to go in the field or influence the police reaction to an incident because you had an observer right there. And they're going to produce a report and then present it to command staff in the police department. And then in turn, we're going to do a combined strategy on how we can train my staff. So I think to get to the heart of the question that was presented, it really is about relationships. It's the willingness, starting with the executives, the chief, believing that research and academia are going to have value in how you do your deployment or how you train your staff. Once you make that connection, I think everything else falls into place. So I have great relationships with the professors at the university, and in turn, there's a mutually beneficial path forward. We gain through their research, their knowledge. But if anybody has worked with academia before, they are so thirsty for what we have. And what we have is data. We have so much data that researchers want to get a hold of. And at times that's another hurdle because some departments are reluctant to release all their data or reluctant to invite outsiders in to observe their policies, observe their staff, and at times be critical of what we're doing. So it really is that partnership and the willingness to receive what academia has. And at times that can be in conflict. Again, what police do, what academia wants to do does not always marry up well. But I think once you can bridge that gap and partner, the outcomes are great. And I can only tell you from my experience that I've had nothing but a positive experience working with academia. And I'll go back to my time. I was with the Police Foundation on a fellowship for 6 months, and that was back in 2011, 2012. They're now the National Police Institute. They were the Police Foundation. And I worked on some research projects and worked with the researchers at MPI. And that really opened my eyes at that point in my career. I think at the time I was probably a lieutenant or a captain. It really opened my eyes as to how much we need to embrace research and the data points we have to better police our communities.
So I'm going to jump in now and I'm going to ask Ganesha a question. And I think you've touched on this a little bit, but it comes from the Q&A. In communities with a history of negative police encounters, but ongoing safety concerns, how can police presence be increased without re-traumatizing or alienating residents? What approaches have you seen that work to rebuild the trust? And as you kind of consider that, one of the things we've done here at Temple is trauma-informed, victim-informed training for all of our police officers, just to get them into that mindset, especially when you have newer officers that are coming into an environment that they've never worked in. They don't understand maybe the community dynamics. And that's been helpful in getting people to take a step back. So, with your different and very diverse experiences, both within your business, but then also working in the city, when you were working for government, what have you seen that has worked in this kind of situation?
Yeah, I want to double down just on the trauma-informed training. I remember hearing about this. Some of the detectives came to me and they were saying, "Oh, we're going to paint the room and it's going to be this and that." And I was like, I don't know, bring me the writing on that. But I have to tell you, when I walked into that room, and I've walked into several rooms now, that are even designed with with those concepts in mind, I feel like, if I'm stressed, like I feel it come down. So, bringing those things inside are important. When you ask a question, it made me think of kind of this concept I've been playing with of human-centered policing, and the baseline there is you've got to take care of the cops in the system right now. The system doesn't take care of the human beings that we need, right? So you've got to take care of the cops before they can go out and take care of the traumatized community. And I remember during the uprisings, our CIT lieutenant stopped and she said, "Chief, you all always talk about procedural justice outside, but what about procedural justice inside?" And so, one of the things I really started to focus on is addressing the trauma that the police encounter in the community, so that they can better serve our communities. I think is a huge thing. The other thing, I'll go back, and I know I keep saying this, but it really has bared to be true in my experience, is going and talking to the community members. I'm actually toying with, it's very, very far away. People call me an idea fairy. So this is just one of my ideas that we'll see. But I want to use body-worn camera analytics to start analyzing interactions, right? The Patterson Police Department used Trulio to they taught them procedural just language. They did a baseline. They saw how they were talking to folks. And then after they had the training, they're looking at how they're talking to folks afterwards. I'd like for us to be able to train folks in a particular district on what that community has defined as respect. Understanding that the way you can pull up in your cruiser, you might just be going call to call. It might even feel fun. I know it is sometimes when I drive like that, right? But that can cause trauma just in the way you pull up in your cruiser in a community. And you don't know that if you don't talk to the community, if you don't talk to the young person, if you don't, right? Because even some of the older folks think, "Oh, these young people, blah, 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 blah," right? So just really hearing from them and understanding what that trauma has done to them. This is the last thing I'll say. But I remember one of the commissioners I worked for, who was not from Baltimore, but said, when he went to the scene of a homicide and there was a body still there and the kids were just walking by. It was just kind of like a normal day. And he says, "Well, what do we do about that?" Right. And so I think you just have to be very intentional. Then comes in the resources on the other end and making sure you have those, which can be difficult in some cities. But being able to identify that trauma and then the interventions to deal with that, both on the police and community side, I think are key.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for doing a wonderful job of picking up while I was on a technology vacation. My system, I had a power failure, but popped during the middle of this. But I come back on. I said, I don't need to be there. They're doing great. So thank you very much. And I see you got to the question. So I think what I want to do now that we're almost the end, I wanted to spend just the last couple minutes and then let you go on with your day talking about vision for the future. And Jennifer, since you're on the screen, I'm going to start with you. But if you think about, you've talked a lot about what's going on right now and all the things you're doing to build this community trust and build this, more importantly, build a dialogue with the community. Where do you envision the future and what are the things that we should be looking forward to?
I think there's a lot of things. I think you have to kind of look internal in the department and external to the department. When we look at the challenges with law enforcement right now with recruitment and retention, our image, how are we messaging? Those are things that we have to continue to do. We have to spend a lot of time and resources. One of the things I was fortunate is I brought in a director of communications and messaging, because if somebody is not attending to that every day, you are missing opportunities. You're missing opportunities not only to be transparent and say this is what is going on in our community, but you're missing opportunities to share all the positive things that your agency is doing to impact the community. So I think agencies, if they're really looking on like, what are those, things that I can get the most return on investment? I mean, it's always policies and people, right? We want to have strong policies, and we want to have people that are coming into this job with shared purpose, that are committed. I try to think every day, regardless of the challenges, I want to lead with love. I want to be thoughtful. I want to, no matter how much unhappiness or disrespect or, that I might receive, I always want to lead with compassion and love and remind myself like, we're the guardians of our communities, and we set the stage for that communication. So I think messaging is really important. I think externally, when we look at the challenges that we face in law enforcement, when we look at funding, the changing dynamics on a daily basis for the demands, policing is one of those jobs that we continue to ask more every day. Police officers aren't just rolling, we became law and order maintenance during its inception, and we are now social workers, mental health workers. At a university environment, we are parents, we are a brother or sister, we are an aunt and uncle to somebody, we are, a mentor, in addition to all of the other things, but we have to prepare people for that moment. We have to make sure that we are training to the highest standards to these policies. We want people who are coming into policing to be ready to handle the variety of issues that they will have to face. And so I think training more so than ever before is critically important. And then officer safety and wellness is, as Ganesha said, if we're not taking care of the individual, they're not going to be able to take care of the community. And so, I could go on, but those are the couple things that I really think when we look internal and external to the policing, what we really need to attend to.
Thank you very much. And I think all the points you made are spot on. And I think you need people to come in today with eyes wide open, no doubt. And how does that training play? I'm going to go to Chief Huchler, and I'm going to let Ganesha, who I know has a lot of ideas, close it out for us. Dave, thoughts?
Well, I think Chief Griffin really summed it up. The one thing I can tell you that the challenges we face are not necessarily new. It is, going back to the beginning, Jay, on community policing and what we're trying to achieve, and engaging our community, collaborating with our community. There has been I think for many of us, we've been in this for several decades, and there is a path that's been laid. And I think all too often we take that path and we just try and create a new path for ourselves, as opposed to embracing what's been researched or embracing what's been successful. And the examples I can give you, the idea of procedural justice is not new. It's something I think that if embraced and built into your culture, I think helps internal and external to the organization, makes policing better, makes police officers safer. But for some reason, we're always trying to try and reinvent that wheel. And if we just embrace it and ingrain it into the culture, we're better served. When you look at a roadmap, I still look at the 2015 21st Century Policing Report. Within those 6 pillars of that report, whether it's community policing, procedural justice, officer health and wellness, technology, it has created a foundational document that I think if we can build upon that, we would again have great success. Going forward, I think, as Chief Griffin mentioned, it is about training that next generation of cops. We've had such tremendous turnover in the last 5 years, 10 years, and for my department, we're coming up on another wave of retirements. And so it is really preparing that next generation with the tenets of policing that we've learned throughout our careers, and ensuring that it's implemented in a manner that's, constitutionally correct, ethically correct when it comes to the rapid changes in technology. And again, as I kind of started out the conversation, following the pathway of those that have done this before us and taking what's been successful and ensuring that that continues.
All right. Thanks, David. Well, as we both know, education, I think, oftentimes will be the key. It just as we keep moving forward. And then for our last comment for the evening or for the afternoon, Ganesha, and then we'll go ahead and close.
I'll try and be brief because both of the chiefs really hit on some major things. So I'll just add on to two things they said. One, the training. I think that we're actually failing our officers across the country with the level of training that we're given, both the quality and whether it speaks to what they're actually seeing on the ground. So I think that we can really improve there. And I think technology might be able to help us do that as a force multiplier. Even in this context of community policing, I wanted to use virtual reality as a way to help engagement on both the police and community side. And I think I just found an example of Santa Monica Police Department is doing something similar. And then once that training is done, I'm going to steal the Chuck Ramsey quote here of operationalizing it. So when you get out of the academy, what are the mechanisms for the frontline supervisors? As you all know, a lot of times the rank and file get training that the command staff never even have seen. And so how do we make sure that when officers' butts are in seats before roll call, they are very clear on the expectations from those trainings, and how is that kind of reinforced? And then what are the metrics that we're using to measure that performance and the fact that they understand their job, and then being able to use that data to be transparent with our community for those feedback loops. And then the last thing that I'll say, which I think is going to be one of the toughest things for us to do, is for us to continue to build trust with our communities without alienating our officers. Because what often happens is there's this new training, as the chief mentioned, and it's a knee-jerk reaction. Let's do that. And the officers feel like, and some justified, and then some, we just got the ones that are going to complain sometimes all the time. But understanding that they are humans, that they have these pressures, what is said about them, whether there's the ones that did it or just because they're the ones wearing the uniform, does affect them. And so how do we continue to push these expectations that our communities have, which are justified? We are a service profession, but without making them feel, to the chief's point, they're social workers and all these things already, without them feeling more put upon. And I think that is going to be very difficult, but one of the most important things we do as we move forward over the immediate future. So I'll stop there.
Very good. Well, that brings us to the end of today's session. When I log off, we will be logging off. But I wanted to say this. Thank you so very much for all agreeing to be panelists. I thought it was a fantastic conversation with different viewpoints, different perspectives. I'm glad you're hopefully not on to your fifth one right after this, but it's been wonderful to have you here. And I guess my parting gesture is say, let's keep working together to advance public safety. That's what we're trying to do through these processes, and make sure it's rooted in trust and transparency. So I thank all of you for participating today. I thank everyone who logged on to join us. And with that, I bid you adieu.
Take care, Jay. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, Dave.
Take care.
Thanks again. Really appreciate it. Ganesha, thank you very much.